Tonight, the Pictish heartland of northern Scotland, 700 AD, Picts and the Standing Stones. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The darkness over the Tay estuary is not complete. There is a thin grey line along the eastern horizon, somewhere beyond the low hills of Fife across the water. The river itself is black and still. A heron stands at the edge of the shallows near the mouth of the Almond, motionless as it has stood for the last hour. The settlement at Abernethy sits on its low ridge above the south bank of the Tay. It is a small place by any measure, but it carries weight. A timber church stands here, a monastery of some kind, modest in its construction, its walls of split oak planks set into the earth. The monks inside will not rise for another half hour. For now, the settlement breathes slowly in the dark. To the north, across the water, the land rises into the hills of Gowrie. The Pictish name for this territory is already old. The people who work this land have worked it for generations without number. The field systems that run along the lower slopes of those hills were laid out long before the 7th century. They are still in use now in 700, and they will be in use long after. The air at this hour carries the smell of the river. It is a cold mineral smell, the smell of silt and moving water and the particular dampness of a Scottish estuary in autumn. The month is October. The harvest has been gathered in, or most of it has. The barley and oats that were cut in September are stored now in timber granaries built up on posts to keep the rats out. The smell of that stored grain, slightly dusty, slightly sweet, drifts down from the settlement when the wind shifts. There is a track that runs north from Abernethy toward the river crossing. It is not a Roman road. The nearest Roman roads are further south and west, and they are already old and partly overgrown by 700. This track is beaten earth, wide enough for a cart, and in wet weather it holds the water in its ruts for days at a time. This morning it is firm and cold. The mud has frozen very slightly at the surface. Each footprint left the previous evening is now crisp and set, as if the earth has decided to keep a record of everyone who passed. Across the Tay to the north, the ridge of Moncrieff Hill is a dark mass against the lighter dark of the sky. It was a place of significance before the Picts gave it a name, and the Picts have given it a name that refers to the hill itself, to the bare rocky crown that catches the light in the morning. In 700, the lower slopes of Moncrieff are partly wooded. There is sessile oak and birch along the eastern face, and alder in the wet ground near the river's edge. Higher up, the vegetation thins to heather and coarse grass. No one sleeps up there at this hour. The hill belongs to the dark and to the deer that move through the oak wood without sound. Further north and west, the Pictish district of Fortriu extends into the hills. This is the heartland of Pictish power in this period. The kings who claim authority over the northern Picts rule from somewhere in this territory, though no single fixed capital in the modern sense exists. Power moves with the king from royal estate to royal estate, and the estates are scattered across the landscape of Strathion and beyond. One such estate sits near the confluence of the Erne and the Tay. The timber buildings of that estate are dark now, and the king, or his representative, is asleep inside. The Erne itself runs quiet in this hour before dawn. It has come down from the hills to the west, from the slopes near Crieff, and from the high ground of Glen Artney further still. By the time it reaches the flat ground near its junction with the Tay, it is a slow river, wide and shallow in places, with gravel beds where salmon rest on their way upstream. In October, the last of the salmon run is nearly finished. The fishermen who set their basket traps in the shallower channels have been working hard this past month. Some of those traps are still in the water now. They will be checked at first light. To the east, the Pictish district of Angus begins somewhere beyond the hills that ring the Sidelaw Range. The Sidelaws in 700 are not heavily settled at their heights. The high ground is used for summer grazing, and the cattle that spent the warm months up there have already been brought down to the lower pastures and into enclosures near the settlements. Winter fodder is a constant preoccupation. The hay that was cut and dried through July and August is stacked in the fields and near the byres. It will not last beyond February if the winter is hard. If the winter is hard, cattle will be slaughtered in November, and the meat will be salted or dried over the fire. The smoke is one of the first things a person notices about a Pictish settlement at any hour. Even now, before the working day begins, the fires inside the roundhouses and the longer rectangular halls have not gone out. They are banked low, kept alive through the night with slow-burning peat. The peat comes from the mosses to the east and north, from the blanket bog that covers the lower ground where drainage is poor. Cutting peat is summer work, and drying it takes weeks. By October, the year's supply is stacked near each house, covered with turf or bracken to keep the worst of the rain off. The roundhouses in these settlements are not small. The larger ones are 12 meters across or more, with walls of stone set in earth or of wattle and daub, depending on the local materials, and a conical roof of thatch. The roof is the critical thing. It must shed the rain, and in this climate the rain is frequent. Old thatch is a problem. It compresses and holds water and eventually rots the timbers beneath. Rethatching is a community effort, something that requires many hands over several days. The reed and straw and bracken used for thatching come from different places depending on what is available. Near the river, reed is common. On the higher ground, bracken and heather serve the purpose. Inside those houses, at this hour, families are sleeping. The sleeping arrangements are practical. The animals are not always kept outside. In the coldest months, a cow or two might be brought into the byre end of a longer building, separated from the human sleeping space by a low partition. The warmth of the animal keeps the temperature inside bearable. The smell is something a modern person would find difficult, but in 700 it is simply the smell of home. People sleep on platforms of timber set along the inner walls, raised a little above the floor level to keep them out of the drafts that come in at ground level. The bedding is straw, covered with skins. Cattle hide, sheepskin, deer skin. A family of any means would have several skins layered together. The wool blanket exists in this period, though weaving the fabric is slow work on a warp-weighted loom. A blanket is a valuable thing. The first birds begin before the light, a robin somewhere near the edge of the settlement in the scrub at the field boundary, then a blackbird further away near the oak wood to the east. These sounds carry very far in the still, cold air. Inside the houses, people are beginning to stir, the lightest sleepers first. A child who needs to go outside, a woman who is thinking about the day. The water source for the settlement at Abernethy is a spring that rises on the slope above the site. The spring is reliable year-round, which is part of the reason this location was chosen. In October, the flow from the spring is strong, fed by the autumn rains. The water collects in a shallow stone-lined basin before it runs off down the slope toward the river. Fetching water is morning work. The vessels used are wooden, turned on a lathe, or ceramic, low-fired and thick-walled. A good wooden vessel with tight joints will hold water without leaking for years. A ceramic vessel dropped on the frozen ground this morning will break. The pigs are the first domestic animals to make noise. They are kept in a pen at the edge of the settlement, away from the sleeping areas because of the smell and the sound. They are large animals, closer in build to the wild boar than to any modern domestic breed. Long-legged, dark-bristled, with a pronounced snout. They eat almost anything, which makes them useful. Kitchen waste, root vegetables that are too old, scraps from butchering other animals. A pig that has done well through the summer and autumn is a significant asset when November comes and slaughter begins. The cattle are quieter at this hour. They stand in their enclosures, which are defined by low stone walls or timber fences, and they breathe slowly in the cold air. Their breath rises as steam. The enclosures are near enough to the houses that a person lying awake inside can hear the occasional movement, the shift of hooves on the cold ground. The cattle of Pictish Scotland in this period are small by later standards. They are hardy, but they are not the large beef animals that selective breeding will eventually produce. Their backs stand perhaps a meter high at the shoulder. They are kept primarily for milk, for traction, and eventually for meat and hide. The grey line in the east is widening now. It has moved from a faint suggestion to something definite. The hills of Fife across the Tay are becoming visible as dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky. The river below them is still black, but there is the beginning of a silver quality to the water where it runs over the shallows near the north bank. On the ridge above Abernethy, the timber church is still dark inside. The monks who maintain this place follow a rule of prayer that will bring them to their feet before the sky is fully light. The church itself is a simple structure, perhaps 15 meters long and 6 meters wide, with a thatched roof. There is no tower, not yet. The round tower that will eventually stand at Abernethy belongs to a later century. In 700, the monastic enclosure is defined by a low earthen bank, roughly circular, with a single entrance on the eastern side. Inside this enclosure, there are the church, a handful of small cells for the monks to sleep in, a larger building that serves as a scriptorium and refectory combined, and a small garden where herbs are grown. The monks at Abernethy are Pictish. The Christianity that came to this part of Scotland came through several routes, from the Irish missions associated with Columba and his successors, and from contacts with the Northern Church more broadly. By 700, the faith is well established in this territory, though the older sacred places in the landscape, the springs and the hilltops and the carved stones that stand in the fields, carry their meaning alongside the new religion rather than being entirely displaced by it. Those carved stones are among the most distinctive things in this landscape. They stand in the fields, at track junctions, near the entrances to settlements. In 700, many of them are still being made. The carvers who cut the symbols into the face of the stone are working in a tradition that has been developing for perhaps 2 centuries by this point. The symbols themselves, the double disc, the crescent and V-rod, the beast, the mirror, appear with consistency across the Pictish territory from Caithness in the far north to the Forth in the south. What they mean exactly is not recorded in any text that survives, but they are clearly meaningful. They are cut with care and precision, and they are placed with intention. The stone used for these carvings varies by location. Near Abernethy and along the Tay Valley, the local sandstone takes a cut reasonably well. Further north, in Angus and into the Mearns, different stones present different challenges and different possibilities. The carver who works a piece of fine-grained sandstone can achieve a smoothness and a delicacy of line that coarser stone will not allow. The tools are iron, and the iron has to be of good enough quality to hold an edge against stone. Ironworking is present in Pictish settlements by this period, though large-scale smelting is not a feature of every community. The light is growing. In the east, it is now unmistakably the approach of dawn. The color is not dramatic. It is the pale, washed color of an October morning in Scotland, a grey-white that gives shape to things without yet giving them warmth. The hills on both sides of the Tay Valley are emerging from the dark. Moncrieff Hill to the north, the lower ground of Strathion reaching away to the west. The first detail is coming back into the world after the long night. A door opens in the settlement. Someone comes out into the cold air, pulling a wool cloak around their shoulders. The cloak is the standard outer garment of this period, a large rectangle of woven wool pinned at the shoulder with a simple brooch. The wool is undyed or dyed with plant material to produce the muted colors that this landscape itself. The light comes before the sun. In the valley of Strathmore, in the year 700, the sky above the Grampian foothills turns from black to a deep, cold grey. The frost has not yet lifted from the grass. Cattle stand still in the enclosures beside the settlement, their breath rising in small clouds. The first person awake is already moving. She is a woman of perhaps 30 years. She sleeps in a roundhouse built from timber posts and wattle, with walls packed with clay and dung to keep out the wind. The floor is beaten earth, covered in a thick layer of rushes that were gathered from the banks of the River Isla in late summer. She pulls a woolen wrap around her shoulders before she stands. The fire in the central hearth has burned low through the night, but the embers are still orange beneath the grey ash. The roundhouse is perhaps 12 meters across. It holds 2 families, perhaps 8 people in total. The sleeping spaces are divided by low wicker screens. Cattle and sheep were brought inside during the hardest nights of winter, and the smell of them lingers in the thatch. Above her, the roof timbers disappear into the dark. The smoke from last night's fire has blackened the lower rafters over many years. She adds dried peat to the embers, then a handful of dry birch wood. The fire takes hold slowly. She sets a flat stone beside the flame and begins to grind barley on a rotary quern, a hand-turned stone tool that sits on the floor near the hearth. The grinding produces a coarse flour. It takes her nearly half an hour to produce enough for the morning meal. This is ordinary labor. It happens every day. The barley is mixed with water drawn last night from the nearest stream, which runs down from the hillside no more than 40 meters from the roundhouse door. The mixture goes onto the hot, flat stone. It makes a thin, dense cake, closer to what would later be called a bannock. There is also a small clay pot of something left from the evening before. It contains a broth made from kale, leeks, and a small amount of salted mutton. The mutton came from an animal slaughtered in late October, when the grass stopped growing and feeding all the livestock through winter became impossible. The meat was salted and stored in a wooden barrel near the wall. Outside, the sky is lighter now. A man emerges from the roundhouse beside hers. He is a metalworker, a smith, and his hands are permanently darkened by charcoal and iron scale. He wears a tunic made from undyed wool, roughly woven, falling to just above the knee. Over it he has a thicker rectangular cloak, also wool, fastened at the right shoulder with a simple iron pin. His feet are wrapped in leather, cut from cattle hide and shaped with an awl and a leather cord. These are not boots in any later sense. They are soft shoes, soled with the thickest part of the hide, and they will not last the full year. He walks perhaps 200 meters to the place where he works. The smithy is a separate, smaller structure set away from the main settlement buildings because of the fire risk. It has a stone-lined hearth at its center, a bellows made from animal hide stretched over a wooden frame, and a collection of iron tools hanging from a wooden peg on one wall. There is a hammer, several punches, tongs made from iron, and a swage block made from a dense piece of local sandstone. The anvil is a large squared lump of iron, rare and valuable, inherited from the smith who taught him. He works iron. The iron itself comes from bog ore, collected from the marshy ground near the edges of local lochs and river margins. In this part of Pictland, deposits of limonite, a brownish iron-bearing mineral, form in waterlogged soils. The ore is smelted in a small furnace outside the smithy, producing a rough bloom of iron full of slag. The smith then heats the bloom in the forge and hammers out the slag through repeated folding and striking. What he is making this morning is a simple agricultural blade, a share for a wooden ard plough. The settlement has two ards, and one of the shares cracked during the last ploughing season. The Pictish heartland in 700 occupies the broad fertile lowlands between the Highland edge and the North Sea coast. Strathmore, Strathian, the Howe of the Mearns, the coastal plain of Buchan. These are the most productive farming lands in northern Britain at this time. The settlements here are not towns. They are clusters of round houses and rectangular timber halls, surrounded by small enclosed fields, drainage ditches, and the open pasture beyond. The land has been farmed for centuries before this morning. A second man leaves the settlement just as the light becomes fully grey. He is a ploughman, and he is leading a pair of oxen. The ard he pulls behind him is largely wooden, with an iron tip. It does not turn the soil in the way a mould-board plough would. It scores a line through the earth, loosening it. He will cross-plough the field, running furrows in two directions to break the ground sufficiently for sowing. The field he is working is about 1/2 hectare. It lies immediately north of the settlement, protected from the worst of the west wind by a low ridge. The oxen are broad-shouldered, dark-colored beasts. They are smaller than the cattle breeds of later centuries. They wear a simple wooden yoke tied across the neck with leather straps. The ploughman walks behind them, guiding the ard with both hands, his eyes on the earth. He has eaten this morning the same barley cake, the same cold broth. He will work until the light fails. Closer to the River Isla, a boy of perhaps 12 years is pulling fishing lines from the water. The lines were set the previous evening. They are made from twisted plant fiber, most likely nettle stem, which produces a surprisingly strong cordage when dried and spun. Each line carries a series of bone hooks, shaped from cattle rib. The river at this point is clear and runs over gravel. It holds salmon, trout, and eel. This morning he pulls up 3 brown trout and a long, dark eel. He kills them with a quick strike on a flat stone at the bank. He carries them back to the settlement in a shallow basket woven from split willow. There are weavers in this settlement. The cloth they produce is entirely wool, taken from the small, dark-fleeced sheep that graze the hillside pasture. The wool is gathered in late spring by plucking rather than shearing. It is then washed, combed with wooden cards set with iron teeth, and spun on a drop spindle into thread. The loom is a vertical warp-weighted loom set against the inside wall of one of the larger roundhouses. Stones with central holes hang from the lower warp threads to keep them taut. The weaver passes the weft thread back and forth using a bone or antler shuttle. The cloth produced is dense and tightly woven, well suited to the damp and cold. The colors of the cloth are not the bright tartan patterns of later imagination. They are the natural colors of undyed wool, cream, brown, and a deep, warm gray. Some cloth is dyed. Weld produces a dull yellow. Woad, grown in small cultivated patches near the settlement, produces a blue that fades to gray-green after washing. Lichens scraped from the rocks on the hillside can produce a range of warm tawny, and reddish-brown tones. The dye is fixed using iron-rich water, urine that has been left to ferment, or a mordant made from alum if the trader from the coast has passed through recently. There are carpenters too. In Pictland in 700, wood is worked with iron tools, axes, adzes, chisels, and draw knives. The carpenter this morning is splitting oak planks from a short log using a froe, a blade struck with a wooden mallet. He is making the sides of a new storage chest. The joints will be cut by hand with a chisel and mallet. No nails are used. The pieces lock together with carefully cut mortise and tenon joints, held firm with wooden pegs. When finished, the chest will be used to store folded cloth or dried grain. It will last, if kept dry, for 30 or 40 years. The settlement stands near a souterrain. These stone-lined underground passages are a distinctive feature of Pictish settlement in this region. They are not houses. They are storage chambers built to maintain a cool, stable temperature through the year. The souterrain at this settlement is about 15 meters long, cut into the sloping ground, lined with dry stone walling and roofed with large flat slabs. Inside, at this time of year, there are pottery vessels filled with preserved foods, a wooden barrel of salted butter, and several sacks of dried grain. The temperature inside does not vary much between summer and winter. The food inside lasts longer than it would in the open air. The pottery in use here is plain and functional. It is hand-built, not thrown on a wheel. The clay is gathered locally, mixed with crushed rock or broken pottery fragments to strengthen it, then shaped by coiling and smoothing. It is fired in a simple clamp kiln, a pile of pottery covered with fuel and burned in the open. The temperatures reached are not very high. The resulting vessels are thick-walled, slightly rough, and not watertight without a coating of organic residue from repeated use. Cooking vessels show heavy sooting on the outside from years of fire. The settlement is governed, loosely, by the figure of the local noble or chieftain. In the Pictish political structure of 700, the land is divided into territories called tuaths or their Pictish equivalents, each under the authority of a local lord who owes military service and tribute upward through a hierarchy of greater kings. At the top of this structure, in 700, sits Nechtan, son of Dirail, who rules as king of the Picts from his stronghold at or near the site later known as Forteviet in the plain of Strathion. His authority reaches across the breadth of this landscape, but the people in this settlement know his name mostly as an abstraction. What they know directly is the reeve or local steward, who comes twice a year to collect the renders owed. Those renders are paid in kind: grain, cattle, cloth, and labor. Each household owes a set amount of barley or oats, a number of days of ploughing or harvesting on the Lord's land, and occasionally a length of woven cloth. The figures are not written down here. They are held in memory, maintained through repeated practice, and enforced by social pressure and the reeve's authority. The Pictish language spoken in this settlement is a Brittonic tongue, closely related to the ancestral language that also underlies later Welsh and Cumbric. By 700, it is a distinct language, no longer mutually intelligible with the Bretonic spoken further south. The words for the tools, the animals, the fields, the weather, the directions, the numbers are all in this language. There is also Latin known to the clergy. A small monastery stands on a raised terrace above the valley floor, perhaps 4 kilometers to the east. It is not large, perhaps 12 monks. They farm their own land, keep cattle, copy manuscripts, and maintain a small church built in timber, not yet in stone. One of those monks rose well before dawn. He rose at the hour of vigils, around 2 in the morning, to sing the psalms in the dark church with his brothers. He then slept briefly, rose again at Lord's before first light, and is now sitting at a writing desk in the scriptorium, a small room attached to the south side of the church. He is working on a copy of the Psalms. The vellum is made from calf skin, scraped thin on a stretching frame, and then cut to size. The ink is made from oak gall, iron sulfate, and gum arabic. The quill he writes with is from a goose, cut and shaped with a small knife. The letters are insular majuscule, the distinctive rounded script of the Irish and Pictish church in this period. Back in the settlement, the children are awake. A girl of perhaps 9 is carrying water in a wooden bucket from the stream to the roundhouse. The bucket is made from staves of oak bound with an iron hoop. It holds perhaps 6 liters. She makes 2 trips each morning. The water is used for cooking, for the animals, for mixing clay, for rinsing cloth. There is no well at this settlement. The stream is the only source. In dry summers, the stream runs shallow and the water becomes cloudy with peat. In wet winters, it runs full and cold, and the crossing stones downstream are sometimes submerged. A man who lives at the edge of the settlement works leather. He is a currier and a cordwainer combined, in that he both processes the hides and makes objects from them. The hides come from the cattle slaughtered in autumn. They are first soaked in a pit of water mixed with oak bark, which contains tannin. The tanning process takes many weeks. The resulting leather is stiff but durable. He works it with a bone smoother until it is supple enough to cut and stitch. He makes shoes, straps, harness parts, bags, and sheaths for knives. His tools are an awl, a curved knife, a bone folder, and needles made from thin iron wire. The thread he uses is waxed with beeswax to help it pass through the leather without fraying. The morning mist lies flat across the valley of the River Tay. It sits in the low ground between the ridges, thin and pale, not yet burned off by the sun. The cattle in the fields beyond the timber enclosure are still. A dog moves along the edge of the settlement, nose down, following something in the wet grass. The settlement sits on a raised gravel terrace above the floodplain. It has been here for generations. The ground around it is worn smooth by feet and hooves and the dragging of loads. There are perhaps 40 or 50 people living within the enclosure and more in the scattered farmsteads on the slopes above. The first work of the day is already underway. The grain store was opened before full light. 2 women are moving grain from the store to the quern stones set up near the center of the settlement. They carry the grain in wooden bowls, held against the body with both arms. The grain is barley, grown in the fields to the south of the enclosure, harvested 6 weeks ago and dried slowly over a low fire before storage. The quern stones are rotary querns, each one a pair of flat circular stones, the lower fixed, the upper turned by hand. The upper stone has a wooden handle pegged into a hole near its edge. One woman kneels, the other sits on a low stool. They take turns feeding grain through the central hole in the upper stone and turning it in steady circles. The sound is a low, continuous grinding, rough and dry, not unlike the sound of feet on gravel. It fills the space around them without traveling far. The flour that comes out between the stones is coarse. It falls in a slow ring onto the flat stone below and then onto a piece of woven cloth laid beneath the quern. The women work without rushing. The rhythm is set by the weight of the stone and the effort of the arms. A full morning of this work will produce enough flour to feed the settlement for perhaps 2 days. Barley flour mixed with water and a little fat from the autumn slaughter was the staple here. It was pressed flat and baked on a hearthstone heated in the fire. The bread came out hard at the edges and soft in the middle, and it was eaten with dried fish or with kale boiled in an earthenware pot. The kale was grown in a small enclosure directly beside the roundhouses, within arm's reach of the cooking fire. The roundhouses themselves are substantial structures. The walls are dry stone at the base, built to about shoulder height from river cobbles and split stone gathered from the ridge above. Above the stone, the walls are turf, cut in long rectangular blocks and laid in courses. The roof is a cone of timber poles meeting at a central point, covered in layers of heather thatch bound with twisted straw rope. Each house is roughly 12 meters across. Inside, there is a central hearth, a clay-lined pit in the floor, and around the edges, sleeping platforms of timber raised off the ground. The main work of this settlement, and of the Pictish heartland in this period, is mixed farming. But farming here means something more specific than the word suggests. It means a carefully managed cycle of tasks spread across the whole year, each one connected to the next. In late autumn, at the end of October, the cattle that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered. The meat was dried or smoked. The hides were scraped and cured. The bones were cracked for marrow and then used as tools or fuel. Now, in the working day of early autumn, the harvest is the center of everything. The barley and oat fields to the south and east of the enclosure were cut 10 days ago with iron sickles. The sickles are short-bladed, with a curve that fits the grip of one hand. The blade is iron, forged somewhere to the south, traded up through the network of settlements along the valley. The handle is a short piece of antler, fitted to a socket and bound with a strip of wet rawhide that tightened as it dried. The cutting was done by every able adult in the settlement. They moved across the field in a line, each person cutting a swathe about 2 feet wide, pulling the stalks with the left hand and drawing the sickle with the right. The grain was laid in loose bundles on the stubble behind them. Children followed and bound the bundles with twisted stalks. It took 3 days to bring in the main barley field. The field measures roughly 4 acres, and it lies on the best drained ground, the slight south-facing slope above the marshy ground by the river. The cut grain was stacked in small cone-shaped ricks in the field itself, set on a base of flat stones to keep them off the wet ground. Now those ricks are being moved, one at a time, carried on a wooden frame between 2 people, back into the settlement and into the grain store. The grain store is a raised structure, its floor set on timber posts about 1/2 meter above the ground. This keeps the floor dry and makes it harder for rats and mice to reach the grain. The walls are wattle, densely woven from hazel rods, and the roof is steep-pitched thatch. 2 men are at work on this task this morning. They have been walking between the field and the store since before the mist lifted. Each load is perhaps 30 kilograms. They carry it on the frame without speaking. One walks slightly ahead. The ground between the field and the store is a worn path, its surface pressed hard by years of use. In wet weather it becomes a river of mud, and stones have been laid along the worst stretches to give footing. On the eastern edge of the enclosure, another group is working. 3 men and a younger boy are processing flax. The flax was pulled from its stand about 4 weeks ago, and it has been retted since then in the shallow, marshy ground beside the river, submerged under stones to keep it from floating. Retting is the soaking that loosens the fibers from the woody stem. The water here is slow-moving and slightly acid from the peat higher up the catchment. That acidity speeds the process slightly. The retted flax has been pulled out of the water and laid on the bank to dry for the past 2 days. Now it is ready for the next stage. The men are using wooden flax breakers, simple hinged boards of oak about 60 centimeters long. The dried flax stalks are fed between the boards, and the upper board is brought down sharply, again and again, breaking the woody core without cutting the fibers. The sound is a repeated flat crack, regular but not fast, like someone slowly splitting kindling. After breaking, the flax passes to the sketching blade. This is a flat wooden paddle, shaped something like a short oar. The flax is draped over a vertical wooden post and beaten with the paddle to remove the last fragments of the broken core. The fibers that remain after sketching are long and soft, slightly lustrous, a pale straw color. These are the fibers that will be spun into linen thread. Spinning happens indoors and outdoors both. A woman near the doorway of the largest roundhouse is spinning this morning. She holds a drop spindle, a wooden shaft with a clay whirl fitted near the bottom. She drafts the fiber from a bundle held against her body and lets the spindle drop and twist, drawing the thread down in a continuous motion. Her hands move without looking at them. She is watching the settlement boundary and a child sitting near the cattle enclosure. The thread produced here will be woven on an upright loom inside one of the roundhouses. The loom is a simple frame of timber posts, the warp threads held taut by clay loom weights hung from the lower ends. The loom weights are flat and roughly triangular, each one perforated near the top. Many of them have been used so long that the hole has worn slightly oval. They sit in a row along the base of the loom, touching each other slightly, and when the weaving moves, they click together very gently. The cloth produced on these looms is plain weave linen and woolen twill. The woolen cloth is heavier and used for outer garments, cloaks, and tunics. The linen is used for underlayers and for wrapping and carrying. The wool comes from the settlement's own flock of sheep, a small number, perhaps 20 animals, kept on the higher ground above the enclosure. The sheep here are small-bodied, close to what would later be recognized as Soy-type animals. Their fleece is plucked rather than shorn, pulled away by hand in spring when it begins to loosen naturally. The dyes used on cloth here come from local plants. Weld gives a clear yellow. Woad, grown in a small managed patch near the enclosure, gives blue. Overdying weld with woad gives green. The dye process uses a mordant, usually wood ash dissolved in water, sometimes urine collected over several days and allowed to ferment. The mordanting happens before dyeing, and the cloth must sit in the mordant bath for a full day before it will take the color. To the north of the main enclosure, about 200 meters along the ridge, there is a second, smaller working area. This is where the iron tools are repaired and occasionally made. There is a small stone-lined hearth here, built low to the ground, with a clay-lined air channel running beneath it. A bellows made from 2 flat boards and a leather bag forces air through the channel into the base of the fire. The smith, a man who also farms and keeps cattle and does nothing only this, works here 2 or 3 mornings a week. This morning he is resharpening sickle blades from the harvest. He works the iron at a bright orange heat, drawing it out on a small iron anvil set into a block of dense oak. The hammer is a rounded iron head with a short wooden handle. The strikes come at a pace slightly faster than walking, each one slightly adjusted in angle to spread the edge evenly. The scale flakes off the iron with each blow and falls into the grass around the anvil block. After a few heats, the blade is quenched in a bucket of water, and the steam rises in a short white column. The sound of hammering carries across the settlement and down toward the river. It comes in bursts, stops, then begins again. It is one of the sounds that marks a settlement as inhabited, as working. Birds in the hawthorn beside the boundary bank lift briefly when a burst of hammering starts, then settle again. The river itself is part of the working day. The Tay at this point is wide and carries a strong current through the main channel. Close in to the northern bank, there are fish traps, woven baskets of hazel set in the shallow water at angles to direct fish into the narrowing interior. The baskets were checked at first light by a boy of about 12 and an older man. They found 3 salmon and a quantity of smaller fish this morning. The salmon are large, each one perhaps 70 centimeters long, caught as they move upstream in this season. The fish will be gutted and split at the riverbank, and then either cooked today or dried on wooden frames above a slow smoking fire. The smoking fire uses green alder wood and takes 2 days to properly smoke a large fish. The dried fish keeps through much of the winter. It is dense and salty from the smoking and eaten in small quantities, usually broken into a pottage of grain and kale. Beyond the fish traps, the river is crossed at a ford about 300 meters downstream. The ford is marked by a line of large stones set roughly in a line across the riverbed, just visible when the water is low. A wooden post on each bank marks the approach in poor light or high water. The ford is the point where the track from the south crosses the river and continues north toward the higher ground and the next cluster of settlements. Traders and travelers use this ford. A man with 2 pack horses crossed it 2 days ago, moving north with iron bars and a bundle of dressed leather. He stopped for 1 night and then was gone. The pack horses he used were small animals, sturdy and broad across the withers, carrying loads across their backs in paired panniers of wicker lined with leather. The track they followed northward runs along the drier ground just above the floodplain, avoiding the marshy ground that lies between the river and the first line of ridges. The track itself is not maintained in any formal way. It is simply the line where the ground is firm and the going is easiest, and every person who uses it uses the same line, and the line deepens over years until it is clearly visible from the ridge above. Back inside the enclosure, the grinding continues. The women at the quern stones have been working for close to 2 hours. The cloth beneath the lower stone is now covered in a grey-white cone of flour. One woman lifts the corners of the cloth and brings them together carefully, folding the flour into a bundle without spilling it. She carries the bundle inside the roundhouse and sets it near the hearth. The fire there has been burning since before dawn, and the hearthstone at its edge is hot enough to bake on. She begins to work the flour with water from an earthenware jar, pressing it between her palms into a flat round shape about 2 centimeters thick. The bread will take perhaps 20 minutes on each side. The smell of it baking spreads out through the open doorway and across the immediate ground outside. The other woman at the quern has not stopped. She feeds another handful of grain through the hole in the upper stone and sets her weight into the turn, and the grinding begins again, low and constant underneath. The fire has been burning since before dawn. It sits in a shallow pit near the center of the floor, and the smoke rises slowly through a hole left in the thatch above. There is no chimney. The smoke finds its own way out, or it does not. By evening, the rafters are dark with it, and the smell of peat and damp wool is everywhere in the room. The house itself is low. From outside, it barely rises above a man's height at the walls. The walls are stone, dry-laid or mortared with clay, and they are thick, sometimes a meter across. That thickness holds warmth. In Strathmore and the Tay Valley, in the glens running west from the coastal plain of Angus, these houses sat close to the ground as though they were growing out of it. The roof was pitched and thatched with heather, rushes, or straw, depending on what was nearest. It was heavy, and it pressed down on the walls. Inside, the floor was packed earth. In some households, it was covered with rushes cut from the nearby wetlands, laid fresh every few weeks or left longer until they matted down and darkened. The smell of the floor in late autumn was rich and close. Scraps of food worked their way down into the rushes. Small bones, fragments of barley husk, wood ash from the fire when it was raked back too far. The floor was alive in a quiet way. The single main room served every purpose: sleeping, eating, working, keeping animals warm in the coldest months. There was no division into separate spaces, not in most ordinary homes. A family of 5 or 6 people moved around one another in a space perhaps 8 meters long and 5 meters wide. They knew the shape of that space in the dark. They knew where the fire was, where the low wooden platform for sleeping began, where the doorway sat. The doorway was small and low. A person had to duck to enter. This was practical in more than one way. A low entrance held heat inside. It also made the space defensible in a simple sense, slowing anyone who tried to force their way in. The door itself was timber, hung on wooden pegs or leather hinges, and it fitted imperfectly. On nights of hard wind from the east, the cold came through. People turned away from the draft and pulled their coverings tighter. Sleeping arrangements were organized by necessity. The sleeping platform ran along one wall, raised perhaps 30 centimeters above the floor. It was planked timber or woven withies laid across low supports. On it went heather, dried bracken or straw, and over that skins. Cattle hides, sheepskin, deer hide cured roughly and left with the fur inward. The family slept close together in cold weather. Body warmth was not a comfort, it was a calculation. Children slept on the same platform as the adults. Infants were kept nearest the fireside, wrapped in wool. Wool was the primary cloth of the household. It was spun from the fleece of the small, dark-faced sheep that grazed the hillsides above the settlement, sheep closer in build to the sowie than to any modern breed. The fleece was coarse. The yarn spun from it was coarse too, and the cloth woven from that yarn was dense and heavy and not soft against the skin. Children wore it from birth. There was no other option. A woman of the household would spend a portion of every day spinning. The drop spindle was the tool, a simple shaft of wood weighted at one end with a clay or stone whirl. She could spin while walking, while watching a child, while waiting for something else to finish. The thread accumulated slowly. Weaving came later, on an upright loom that stood against one wall. The loom weights, fired clay rings, hung from the warp threads and kept them taut. The sound of the loom working was a soft, rhythmic knock. It was part of the domestic sound of the evening. The household kept a small number of animals. Cattle were the measure of wealth in Pictish society, and even a modest family might keep 2 or 3. In winter, those animals came inside or were kept in a low-roofed byre built directly against the main house, sharing one wall, sometimes sharing a floor. The warmth of cattle moving in the cold months was not wasted. The smell of dung and hay and animal breath spread through the connecting wall. People were accustomed to it from childhood. It was the smell of a household in winter. Pigs were kept too. They fed on scraps and foraged at the edges of the settlement. Their value was different from that of cattle. They did not give milk or pull plows. They gave meat, and they could be slaughtered in autumn when they were fattest, after the acorns and roots of late summer had done their work. Smoking and salting preserved what the family could not eat immediately. A wooden barrel or a clay vessel sealed with fat might hold salted pork through the darkest months. The diet was based on grain. Barley was the principal crop across the Pictish heartland. It grew in the low-lying improved ground near settlements, in the small rectangular fields defined by low earthen banks. It was harvested in late summer with iron sickles, threshed on flat stone or bare ground, and stored in sunken grain pits lined with clay or in above-ground timber granaries. Barley became porridge, flatbread cooked on a flat stone beside the fire, and ale. Ale was not an indulgence. It was part of the daily diet across every level of society. Oats grew on poorer ground further up the slopes. They were more tolerant of the thin acid soils above 500 meters. Oat porridge, oat bread, oat cakes dried hard enough to last several days. These were the foods a person carried if they were traveling or working away from the settlement for a day. They were plain foods, heavy in the stomach, and they were what kept people moving through cold mornings. The quern was in every household. A rotary quern, two flat circular stones, the upper one turned by hand with a wooden peg handle. Grinding grain was daily work. It fell to women and older children. The sound of it was low and steady, grating, and it continued for as long as grain needed to be made into flour. The flour was grey and coarse and still had grit in it sometimes, small particles of stone worn from the quern itself. Teeth wore down early. The evidence of this is in the skeletal record. Vegetables were grown in small plots near the house. Kale, a coarse-leafed ancestor of the modern plant, was probably the most important. It grew through cold weather. It could be boiled into a simple broth, along with whatever else was available: grain, a bone, dried herbs. Wild plants supplemented what was cultivated. Watercress from stream margins, nettles in spring, wood sorrel, the young leaves of hazels. People knew which plants were edible at which time of year. That knowledge was carried in memory, passed from mother to daughter. Fish came from the rivers: the Tay, the Erne, the South Esk, the North Esk. Salmon ran them in numbers that are now difficult to imagine. A man wading with a simple spear or basket trap at the right time of year could take enough fish to feed his household for several days. Eels were caught in traps set overnight in the quieter water near the banks. Smoked or dried over the fire, fish lasted longer than fresh. Coastal families along the Angus shore and up into what is now Aberdeenshire had access to sea fish as well, and shellfish from the rocky shores. Pottery was plain and functional, hand-built rather than wheel-thrown in most domestic contexts, fired at low temperatures in an open fire rather than a proper kiln. The vessels were thick-walled and unglazed. They held grain, liquids, rendered fat, dried plant matter. They broke easily and were replaced regularly. Fragments of them are what remains. A complete pot from an ordinary Pictish household in 700 AD is an unusual survival. Wooden vessels were more common in daily use. Bowls, cups, buckets, and troughs were all made from wood, either carved from a single piece or built up from staves. A skilled woodworker in the settlement could produce most of what a household needed. Alder and ash were common timber choices. The tools for this work included iron adzes, small iron chisels, and knives. Iron was not scarce in Pictish Scotland by this period. The skills to smelt and work it were established, and there were smiths attached to settlements of any size. The smith held an important place. The forge was not inside the house. It was a separate structure, low and open on one side, with a clay-lined hearth and bellows made from leather. The smith made agricultural tools, knives, pins, and fittings for wooden objects. Iron dress pins held cloaks at the shoulder. Those pins were functional objects, but they could also be made with decorated heads, a small expression of craft in an otherwise plain material world. Clothing for an ordinary family was wool from their own animals, dyed if they had access to dyestuffs, undyed if they did not. Weld gave yellow, woad gave blue, though it required processing. Bracken and various barks gave pale tans and browns. Most clothing was probably undyed or only lightly colored, in the natural grey and brown tones of raw fleece. Men wore a tunic reaching to mid-thigh, belted at the waist, with trousers beneath. Women wore a longer dress, also belted, sometimes with an overdress pinned at the shoulders. Leather shoes, simple and soled, were worn by adults. Children went barefoot for much of the year. Personal ornament existed at every level of society, not only among the elite. A bronze pin, a simple bead of amber or glass, a carved bone comb. The comb served a real purpose. Hair needed managing. Lice were present in any crowded domestic space. The fine-toothed bone comb drawn slowly through hair in firelight, that was a nightly task in many households. Combs have survived in numbers. They were made from red deer antler as well as bone, the tines cut carefully, sometimes with simple incised decoration along the back. Children worked from an early age. There was no period of extended childhood in the modern sense. By 5 or 6, a child could herd geese or pigs at the edge of the settlement. By 8 or 9, they were carrying water, gathering fuel, helping with the harvest. A child's hands were useful. Learning happened by watching and doing. A girl learning to spin watched her mother spin, then tried. A boy learning to work would watch the man of the house, then tried. There were no written instructions. There were no schools. The settlement itself was small. A cluster of perhaps 4 to 8 houses, a smithy, storage structures, an area of cultivation around them. These settlements sat on well-drained ground, slightly raised, south-facing where possible. They were not isolated. Other settlements lay within a few hours' walk. Paths connected them, worn into the ground by generations of feet and cattle. Cattle were moved along these paths between seasonal pastures. Goods moved along them too, and people and information. Above the settlements, the land rose into rough grazing, heather moorland, and eventually into high ground that was bare and stony and used only in summer. Below them, in the valley floors, The ground was often still wet. Much of what is now improved farmland in Strathmore and the Tay Basin was waterlogged in 700 AD. Alder carr and reed beds filled the low ground. The settlement chose its position carefully between the wet below and the cold above. The night came down early in November. By the time the last animals were settled and the door was pulled shut, the sky beyond the thatch was already dark. The fire was banked with peat, not put out. Peat burns slowly and holds heat through the night with almost no attention. The glow of it was low and orange, and it threw very little light. Shapes in the room were shadows. The people in the household settled onto the sleeping platform. The sound outside was wind across the thatch, and if the night was still, the distant call of an owl hunting along the field margin below the settlement. Inside, the fire ticked, and the animals shifted in the byre. A child turned in its sleep. The wool coverings were pulled up. The darkness was complete beyond the small orange pulse of the peat. Everything in the room was warm and close, and smelled of smoke and grain and animals, and wet wool drying near the fire. The grinding stone sat where it had been left, the wooden bowls were stacked, the spindle hung from a peg near the loom. Tomorrow the same work would begin again before the light came back. The grain pit needed checking after the rain. The cattle needed water. The fire needed feeding. The sun has gone down behind the ridge above the Tay Valley. The last light sits on the water for a moment, then fades. In the settlement below the hill fort at Forteviet, the fires are low. The smell of peat smoke drifts between the timber buildings. This is a Tuesday evening in late October in the year 700. The people of this place are already thinking about the week ahead. Forteviet sits on flat ground near the river water of May, just before it meets the Tay. It is one of the royal centres of the Pictish kingdom. The land around it is open and damp, with alder woodland along the river margins. There are fields of oats and barley to the east, cut and stored 2 months ago. The ground now is grey-brown and soft underfoot. The settlement itself is not a town in any Roman sense. It is a cluster of timber buildings set within a wider pattern of farmsteads and enclosures. The great hall at the centre is rectangular, built of oak posts with wattle walls and a thatched roof. It is large enough to hold 50 people at a feast. Around it are smaller buildings for sleeping, for storing grain, for housing animals in winter. A few lean-to structures along the western edge are where tools are kept. The people who live here are farmers first. They grow oats for porridge and flatbread and barley for ale. By October, the harvest is done and the stores are in. Dried fish from the summer catch hangs in one of the smaller buildings. There is salted pork from the late autumn slaughter. Root vegetables, mostly turnips, are kept in a pit beneath a wooden cover to the north of the hall. People eat twice a day in this season, once in the morning and once before dark. Sunday begins differently from other days. There is no work in the fields. There is no hauling of timber or digging of ditches. The Christian church has been present in this part of Pictland for at least a generation, carried here by missionaries moving north and west from Northumbrian monasteries and from the Irish tradition through Iona. By 700, the church is woven into the structure of daily life, even if the weave is uneven. People attend a gathering at the local church, which may be nothing more than a small timber oratory set on a slight rise, with a cross of carved stone standing outside it. That carved stone cross is important. In Pictland in this period, the stone carvers are active and skilled. Crosses with interlace patterns, with symbols that carry meaning now only partially understood, stand at significant points in the landscape. They mark boundaries, burial grounds, places of assembly. The one near the Fortiviate Oratory has been set into the ground within living memory. Its surface is still relatively clean, not yet heavily lichened. People pass it every day on their way to the river. The church service on Sunday morning is conducted in Latin, which most of the congregation does not understand. The priest, who may also serve 2 or 3 other small communities nearby, reads from a gospel book. The congregation stands. There are no pews. The building is small, and most people remain outside in the early cold, able to hear the voice but not the words. After the service, they do not immediately disperse. This is the moment in the week when people from the surrounding farmsteads come together. There are perhaps 200 people who consider this place their church and their center. Most of them live within 2 miles. They come on foot along muddy trackways, some carrying children, some leading a dog. When the service is done, they stand in the open ground around the church and talk. News passes here. A man from a farmstead to the north says the bridge over the burn to the west is broken and needs repair. A woman reports that her neighbor's cattle have strayed twice now into her oat field. These conversations happen quietly, standing in groups of 3 and 4. The feast days of the Christian calendar punctuate the year more dramatically. Christmas is observed, though in 700 the full elaboration of Christmas celebration has not yet developed even in the more settled parts of Christendom. Easter is the most significant moment. In the weeks before Easter, there is a period of fasting and reduced food intake. People eat no meat and less ale. This is not difficult to enforce in late winter when stores are low anyway, but it is still felt as a discipline. The priest reminds the congregation of what they are doing and why. Easter itself, in this part of northern Britain in 700, falls according to the calculation method that Pictish and Irish churches have gradually been reconciling with Roman practice. The date of Easter has been a source of genuine disagreement in the 7th century, debated at Whitby in 664, just to the south. By 700, the Pictish Church is moving towards the Roman calculation, though the full adoption is still a few decades away. The Easter gathering at Fortiviate draws people from a wider area than usual. Families walk from 4 and 5 miles distant. The Great Hall is used for a feast that evening. At that Easter feast, there is ale, barley bread, and roasted meat. The slaughter of animals in spring, when winter-weakened livestock might not survive anyway, provides the food. A cow that has struggled through the cold months and is now too thin to be useful is killed. The meat is cooked over a central hearth. People sit on benches along the walls and on the floor. The feast lasts until the fire is low, which in April means it ends before midnight. The gathering of Samhain at the very start of November is older than Christianity in this landscape. By 700, it has not been entirely absorbed into the church calendar, though it sits close to the Christian observance of the dead. Samhain is the turning point of the year. Livestock are brought in from the summer pastures if they have not been already. The animals that cannot be fed through winter are slaughtered now. Their blood soaks into the ground near the enclosures. The smell of it carries across the settlement for a day or two. People do not work in the fields at Samhain, but they are not idle. The slaughter itself is hard labor. Women and men work together to process the carcasses, salting the meat and storing it. Hides are stretched and left to cure. Bones are boiled for marrow. Nothing is wasted. The evening of Samhain is marked by fires larger than the usual hearth fires. These fires are lit on the higher ground, on the ridge above the settlement. Families go up to them in the cold dark. This is not a formal church occasion. It is older, quieter, and more deeply held. The summer feast of Beltane in May is the counterpart. At Beltane, the cattle are driven out to the summer pastures on the higher ground to the north and west. Young men and women go with them to manage the herds through the summer months, living in temporary shelters. This seasonal movement is called transhumance. It is a fundamental rhythm of life in this landscape. The lowland settlement empties slightly each summer. The children who go with the cattle return in autumn, a little taller, more weathered. In the middle of summer, around the feast of St. Peter on the 29th of June, there is another gathering. This one has a different character. It is less solemn than Easter and less ancient than Samhain. It involves exchange. People bring goods. A man comes with a bundle of dressed hides. A woman carries a basket of dried herbs. Someone has a small iron knife made at a smithy 2 settlements to the east. These things are exchanged without any system that resembles a modern market. There is no fixed price, no currency in common use. Exchange is negotiated between people who know each other and who will meet again. The market in a formal sense does not quite exist here yet. What exists is the gathering, and within the gathering, exchange. In larger centers, perhaps at places like Inverness or along the coast of the Moray Firth where sea trade is possible, something more recognizable as a market may occur. Pictland in 700 has contact with traders from Ireland, from the north of England, and from Scandinavia. Fine metalwork, glass beads, and occasionally wine in pottery containers reach these northern settlements through chains of exchange that stretch over hundreds of miles. A glass bead found in the ground of Forteviet might have started its journey in a workshop on the Rhine. The monastery is the other great gathering point. There are monasteries in Pictland by 700, though their number and size vary. Abernethy, on the south bank of the Tay, is an important monastic site. It sits on a low shelf of ground above the river, sheltered from the north wind by a slope behind it. The community there is small, perhaps 15 or 20 monks, living under a rule that draws on Irish monastic practice. They pray 7 times a day at the canonical hours. Abernethy is also a place where books are copied, where young men are educated, and where the sick are sometimes brought. It functions as the nearest thing this landscape has to a permanent learned institution. The abbot of Abernethy has authority over a wide territory, collected as tribute in the form of food renders. Twice a year, men from the surrounding settlements bring sacks of grain, dried fish, and other provisions to the monastery gate. This is not taxation in any state sense. It is an obligation that has grown up through custom and through the Church's authority over burial and baptism. People come to the monastery on the feast days of its patron saint. They come because there is a gathering, because news travels here, and because the monastery is one of the few places where a dispute can be settled with reference to something beyond local custom. The abbot or one of his senior monks can read, can interpret a written grant or a legal judgment. Literacy in 700 in Pictland is almost entirely confined to the church. Outside it, memory and oral agreement carry the weight of law. On ordinary weekdays, the community around Forteviot works from dawn to dusk in the manner of every farming settlement in northern Europe at this time. Men dig drainage channels, repair field boundaries, cut and carry timber. Women spin wool on hand spindles, weave on upright looms, prepare food, and manage the household stores. Children carry water from the river, tend small animals, gather wood. There is no sharp division between indoor and outdoor work. People move between tasks as the season and the daylight require. Clothing is wool almost entirely. The wool comes from the flocks of small native sheep kept on the higher ground. It is carded, spun, and woven by the women of each household. The cloth is undyed or dyed with plant materials, giving colors of brown, yellow, and dull red. Men wear a long tunic reaching to the knee, belted at the waist, with a heavier cloak for outdoor work in cold weather. Women wear longer tunics and may cover their heads with a length of wool cloths. Shoes, for those who have them, are simple leather constructions cut from a single piece and gathered around the ankle with a thong. The river is central to everything. The Tay in 700 is broader and shallower in places than it is today, with wetlands along its margins that have since been drained. Fish are taken from it throughout the year. Salmon are the most prized. They are caught in traps set into the river channel, made of woven willow and wood stakes. In late summer and autumn, when the salmon run, the traps are checked daily. The fish are split and dried on racks in the wind or salted in wooden tubs. Boats on the Tay are small, built of wood, and propelled by oar or by a simple square sail. They are used mainly for fishing and for crossing the river, not for long-distance travel. The crossing points of the Tay are important places in the landscape. A ferry operates at Abernethy, allowing people and goods to cross between the north and south banks. The ferryman lives in a small dwelling near the water's edge. He knows everyone who crosses. The rhythms of the week are marked mainly by Sunday, and the rhythms of the year by the four great turning points of Samhain, Beltane, Midsummer, and Midwinter. Within these large rhythms are the rhythms of the church calendar, with its saints' days and fasting periods. And within those are the rhythms of the farm, which follow the weather and the soil. When frost comes hard in November and the ground cannot be dug, people stay closer to the fire. When March brings the first real warmth and the ground softens, there is ploughing to begin. The Pictish people of this landscape leave no written records of their own. What they thought about their lives, what they believed on Sundays standing outside the cold timber church, what they said to each other at the sound fires on the dark ridge above the valley, is. The River Tay moved slowly in the last light of an October evening. Its water was dark, carrying peat from the upland bogs above Dunkeld. The current pressed against the gravel shallows near the eastern bank, where the stones had been worn smooth over centuries of flood and recession. A heron stood motionless at the river's edge. It had been standing there since, before the sun dropped behind the ridge to the west. The Tay was not then the river a modern eye would recognize. Its flood plain spread wider. In the low ground between what would one day be called Perth and the Firth of Tay, the land was still largely waterlogged. Sedge and rush grew in dense stands along the margins. Alder trees followed the line of every minor drainage channel. Willow scrub held the soft banks together where the current divided and slowed. North of the Tay, the land lifted into broad ridges of glacial till. These ridges were the bones of the Pictish heartland. Strathmore, the great vale running northeast from the foot of the Ochils, was in 700 AD a patchwork of cleared ground and dense woodland. The clearings were old. Some of them had been open for 500 years or more, but between the cleared fields, the forest pressed close. Oak and ash stood on the better drained slopes. Birch covered the higher ground where the soil was thin and the frost lingered longer in spring. The soil of Strathmore was heavy. It held moisture through the winter and drained slowly in the spring. The Picts who farmed it worked with wooden ploughs tipped with iron. They broke the ground in long strips, following the natural slope where they could. The furrows gathered water at their lower ends. The fields had a particular smell in November, when the autumn ploughing was finished and the rain had settled the turned earth flat. A generation before 700 AD, perhaps around 660 or 670, the woodland cover in Strathmore had been somewhat greater. The clearance that produced the field systems visible in the early 8th century was gradual. It measured itself in generations, not in years. A family would take down the trees at the edge of their holding, burn the roots, and break the ground in the first year. By the second year, it would carry a crop of barley. By the time the grandchildren were farming it, no one could remember the trees at all. The landscape of 700 AD was the accumulated result of that quiet, unhurried work. The River South Esk drained the central part of Strathmore, running northeast toward the sea at what the Picts would have known as the estuary near Montrose. The river was smaller then than many suppose. It ran through Willowherb and Meadowsweet in summer. In winter, it spread across its flood plain in shallow sheets of brown water, freezing at its edges in hard frost, thawing by late February when the first curlews came back from the coast. Salmon moved through it in autumn. The Picts trapped them with wicker structures anchored to the riverbed with stones. Further north, the river North Esk descended from the mouth, the broad upland plateau that separates the Mearns from Deeside. The mouth in 700 AD was open moorland above about 300 meters. Heather and deer sedge covered its upper slopes. Bog cotton stood white in the late summer wind. The plateau held water on its flat sections, forming shallow black pools that reflected the sky on still days and turned opaque in the rain. Ptarmigan lived on the higher ground. Red grouse were abundant lower down, where the heather was younger and more vigorous. The mouth was not impassable. Drove roads crossed it at several points. Cattle were moved south over these routes in autumn, following long-established tracks that kept to the drier spurs and avoided the deepest bogs. The cattle were small by later standards. They were dark-colored, short-legged animals, hardy enough to graze through a highland October without shelter. They were brought down from summer pastures in the glens and held through winter in lower ground near the settlements. Their dung was gathered and used on the arable fields in spring. On the eastern coast, between the Mouth and the Murray Firth, the land flattened toward the sea. The coastal strip between Stonehaven and Aberdeen was a narrow shelf of farmland pressed between the upland and the sea. Streams ran down from the hills in short, steep courses, cutting through the raised beach gravels before entering the sea. At the mouth of the River Dee, the ground was low and wet. Salt marsh spread along the northern bank of the estuary. The smell of the sea reached inland for several kilometers on a westerly wind. The Murray Firth itself was a large and quiet body of water in the early evening of a September tide. Its southern shore ran from what is now Inverness eastward toward Buchan. In 700 AD, the settlements along this shore were close to the water. Fishing was practiced from small, hide-covered boats. These craft were light enough to be carried up the beach by 2 men. They were used close to shore, working the sandy bottom for flatfish and the rocky headlands for cod and saithe. Deeper water fishing was possible in summer when the weather was more settled. The Bowley Firth, at the western end of the Murray Firth, was broader in its upper reaches than it is today. The River Bowley brought down considerable volumes of silt during winter spates. Mudflats extended far out from the shore at low tide. Wading birds fed there in the grey light of November mornings. Pink-footed geese arrived from Iceland in October and gathered on the stubble fields near the coast. Their noise, at dusk, when they came in from feeding, was one of the regular sounds of the season in this part of Scotland. The Great Glen ran southwest from the Murray Firth coast to the west coast of Scotland, a distance of roughly 100 kilometers. Along its floor lay a chain of lochs, including Loch Ness. In 700 AD, the loch was surrounded by dense oakwood on its southern and western shores. The trees grew down to the water's edge in places. The north shore was more open, with some cleared ground on the lower slopes. The loch was cold and deep and produced trout. It was fished, but not intensively. The settlements in the Great Glen were spaced far apart. The rivers of the Great Glen were swift and carried heavy loads of gravel and sand. The River Ness, flowing northeast from Loch Ness to the Murray Firth, was broad at its mouth and navigable for small boats for several kilometers upstream. It divided into channels near its estuary, forming low islands of shingle and willow. Otters were common along its banks. Pine marten moved through the woodland above the flood plain. The forest sounds at night along the River Ness in 700 AD were quite different from the sounds of open farmland. There was no silence exactly, but a different kind of quiet. To the east of the Great Glen, the upland of the Cairngorms formed the high interior of the Pictish world. This was not farmland. It was hunting ground, pasture, and timber resource. The native Scots pine forest that covered the lower glens of the Cairngorms was more extensive in 700 AD than it would become in later centuries. Trees grew up the slopes to about 600 meters in sheltered positions. Above the tree line, the plateau was bare and stony, covered with alpine grasses and low-growing crowberry and bilberry. Snow lay on the summit plateaus from October until May or sometimes June. The red deer of the Cairngorms were managed in a loose sense. They were hunted by Pictish nobles in autumn when the stags were in rut and more easily approached. The hunt was a social activity as much as a practical one. It required horses, hounds, and a group of men who understood the terrain. The deer were also important for their hides, which provided leather for shoes, bags, and harness. Antler was used for tool handles and comms. Very little of the animal was wasted after a successful hunt in October. Inland from the coastal strip of Murray, the land rose through a series of broad valleys toward the upland. The River Spey, the longest river in this region, ran northeast from its headwaters near Loch Spey to the sea at what the Picts knew as the Sandy Bay near modern Fochebers. The Spey was powerful and fast. It flooded regularly in spring, when snowmelt from the Cairngorms combined with heavy rain. The flood brought down fine silt and spread it across the lower valley floor, refreshing the soil of the meadows. Farmers along the Spey understood the pattern of the river's behavior. They positioned their buildings on the slightly raised terraces above the flood plain. The birch woodland of the Middle Spey Valley was dense in places and open in others, depending on how recently it had been cut. The Picts used birch for many purposes. It was coppiced to produce straight poles for building and fencing. The bark was stripped for tanning. The inner bark could be used as a writing surface in an emergency, though it was not the preferred material for that purpose. The sap was drawn off in early spring before the leaves opened and fermented into a mild drink. This was done in March, when the days were lengthening but the nights were still cold. The seasonal rhythm of the Pictish year in this part of Scotland was governed by the length of the growing season and the reliability of the harvest. Barley was the main crop in the lowland zones of Strathmore and the Murray coastal plain. It was sown in April when the ground had dried enough to plough without the soil compacting. It came into ear in July and was cut in August if the weather was good. A wet August could delay the harvest by 2 weeks or more. A very wet summer, with rain persisting into September, could mean a partial failure. The community held enough reserves in most years to survive one bad harvest. 2 consecutive bad harvests were more serious. Oats were grown alongside barley, particularly on the higher and wetter ground. They tolerated the conditions better. They were used for porridge and for flatbreads baked on a stone set over the fire. The stone was heated slowly and kept at a steady temperature by adjusting the fuel beneath it. Meals were eaten in the long hall buildings, seated on low benches along the walls. The fire burned in a central hearth. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof. The smell of oat bread and peat smoke was constant in the settlements of the Pictish heartland in the 7th and early 8th centuries. Livestock were the foundation of wealth in the upland zones. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were all kept. Sheep were particularly important on the higher ground, where the soil was too thin and acid for reliable arable farming. The sheep of this period were small, long-legged animals with a coarse outer coat and a fine inner fleece. The wool was plucked by hand in early summer rather than shorn with shears. It was then spun on a drop spindle and woven into cloth on upright looms. The cloth was heavy and water-resistant. It was worn as a large wrapped garment belted at the waist. The change across one generation, from the 660s to 700 AD, was not dramatic in its outward appearance. The fields were perhaps slightly more extensive. The woodland edge had retreated a little on the better soils. Some trackways had been improved by laying brushwood or flat stones over the wettest sections. The number of people living in the region had likely grown slowly. More settlement sites show evidence of continuous occupation through this period. The church had established itself at a small number of centers. Monks worked as scribes, as metalworkers, and as farmers, the same as the people among whom they lived. The harbors of the eastern Pictish coast in 700 AD were not harbors in the later sense. They were recognized landing places, often at the mouth of a river or in the shelter of a headland. Boats were pulled up onto beaches rather than moored. The coast between Stonehaven and Burghead offered several such places. Burghead itself, on its promontory above the Murray Firth, was a major Pictish centre. Its position was chosen for visibility and for access to the sea. From its upper ground, on a clear morning, the line of the Sutherland coast was just. The sun drops behind the ridge of the Mount Hills to the southwest. The light thins across the low ground of Strathmore. It turns the colour of pale horn before it goes. In the fields below the settlement, the last of the barley harvest has been carried in. The stalks lie in rough bundles near the grain store, waiting to be threshed in the morning. The settlement itself sits on a low rise above the River Isla. It has sat there for generations. The houses are timber-framed, their walls packed with wattle and daub, their roofs thick with turf and reed. From the outside, they look like low mounds pressed into the earth. Smoke rises through the roof openings in thin grey columns. It drifts east on a light wind coming down from the Grampian Hills. The people moving between the buildings are tired. They have been working since before first light. The women who spent the morning grinding grain at the rotary quern are setting that task aside now. The men who cut and bundled the last of the barley are washing their hands in the wooden trough near the main gate. The water in the trough is cold. It comes from a small stream that runs along the northern edge of the enclosure. The central hearth inside the largest building is already lit. It burns low at this hour, fed with birch and alder wood cut from the stands of woodland half a mile to the north. The fire does not roar. It settles and breathes in the draught that moves through the doorway. The stones around the hearth are blackened from years of use. They hold the heat long after the flames shrink down. A clay pot sits directly in the coals. It has been sitting there since mid-afternoon. Inside it is a thick broth, mostly water and dried beans, with a piece of salted mutton worked into it. The mutton was slaughtered and salted in the autumn past. It is tough now, but it has given its flavor to the liquid. A handful of dried herbs, gathered from the hillside in summer and hung to dry from the roof beams, has been dropped in as well. The smell of it fills the building and moves out through the thatch. The building is not small. It is perhaps 12 paces across, roughly oval. The floor is beaten earth, swept in the mornings and scattered with dried rushes brought up from the low ground near the river. Along the interior walls, wooden benches have been set against the wattle. Woolen blankets and cured hides are folded on them. This is where people sleep. Tonight, perhaps 8 or 10 people will sleep in this building. Children, older men, the women of the household. The younger men may sleep in the smaller outbuilding to the west. Cattle are already moving into their enclosure for the night. A boy of perhaps 12 years is guiding the last of them through the gap in the wooden palisade. He uses a long stick, tapping lightly at the haunches of a slow cow. The cattle are small by later standards. They are dark-colored, rough-coated, and broad in the shoulder. They smell of wet grass and dung. Their breath steams in the cooling air. The boy latches the enclosure with a wooden bar and then stands for a moment, looking out across the valley. The valley below holds the last grey light. The river Isla catches it faintly. The water runs quick and shallow over gravel beds in late summer, and you can hear it from the settlement on quiet evenings like this one. The sound is constant and low. It has been part of the background of every day in this place for as long as anyone can remember. Beyond the river, the ground rises gently toward further hills. The trees on those slopes are mostly oak and hazel, with some pine higher up. They are dark now, without detail, just a mass of shadow. Inside the buildings, tallow lamps are being lit. The lamps are simple clay dishes filled with rendered animal fat. A wick of twisted rush or moss sits in the fat and is touched with an ember from the hearth. The light they give is small and warm and slightly smoky. It is enough to see a hand's breadth clearly and shadows everywhere else. A woman moves across the room by memory as much as sight. She knows where the pot is, where the bowls are stacked, where the children are sitting. The bowls are wooden. They are turned from ash and oak, smooth inside from long use. Some have small cracks sealed with pine resin. Each person in the household has their own bowl. It is one of the few things they keep as their own. The spoons are also wooden or sometimes made from animal bone. There are no iron-eating tools in this settlement tonight. Iron is saved for blades and agricultural tools. A small iron knife sits on a wooden peg near the doorway. It belongs to the head of the household and is not touched by the children. The meal is simple. The broth is ladled into the bowls using a deep wooden cup. Flatbread has been baked on a stone near the fire. It is made from coarsely ground barley flour, with a little water and salt from the coast, brought inland by traders who pass through Strathmore on the old routeways. The bread is dense and slightly gritty. It is torn into pieces and used to scoop the broth. There may be a few dried berries on the side, or a piece of hard cheese made from ewe's milk and left to dry over the summer months. People eat without much talk at first. The day has been long. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a household at the end of harvest work. It is not an empty quiet. It is a satisfied one. The grain is in. The cattle are in. The fire is lit. The broth is hot. For the moment, that is enough. The dogs settle near the entrance. There are two of them, medium-sized, rough-coated, pale brown with darker ears. They are working dogs, not pets, though the children stroke them freely enough. They have been with the cattle and the fields all day. Now they circle twice and lie down. One puts its head on its paws and watches the door. The other is already asleep. Outside, the dusk deepens. The Grampian Hills have lost their shape now and become only a dark horizon. The sky above them still holds a pale green-blue at the very top, fading to darkness higher up. The first stars are becoming visible, though not yet many. There is no moon yet tonight. Bats move along the edge of the tree line to the north. They are fast and low, following the insects that gather over the stream. The sound of the river is clearer now that the day's activity has stopped. The sounds of the settlement at this hour are few. A cow shifts in her enclosure and makes a low sound in her throat. The fire inside the main building snaps once as a piece of alder wood splits in the heat. One of the children says something, and an adult answers in a quiet voice. The words are in a Brittonic-influenced tongue, part of the P-Celtic speech that the Picts of this region use in these centuries. It is not yet the Gaelic that will later spread into these lands from the west. The sounds are softer and more clipped than either. A man sits just inside the doorway of the main building. He is mending a leather strap by the light of the tallow lamp nearest the entrance. The strap is part of a harness used on the ox that pulls the plough. It wore through today at the buckle point. He is working a bone all through the leather in a careful line, ready to thread a new lace through the holes tomorrow. The work is slow and his eyes are tired. He sets it down after a while, rolls the strap up, and tucks it beside the door for the morning. Along the outer palisade of the settlement, the wooden posts are close together and driven deep into the earth. The palisade is not purely defensive. It keeps the cattle in and the wolves out. Wolves are not unknown in the woods to the north at this time. They come down in the cold months, sometimes in the early morning before the settlement is fully stirring. The dogs know their scent and make noise enough to wake the settlement when they come too close. Tonight there is no alarm from the dogs. The night is still. The grain store stands a little apart from the main buildings. It is raised slightly off the ground on short wooden posts to keep the damp away from the floor and to discourage rodents. The barley brought in today has been added to what was already there. The store smells of dry straw and dust. The door is fastened with a wooden pin. A second, smaller building beside it holds tools, iron-tipped plowshares, wooden-handled sickles, a wooden rake, 2 iron hoes. These are valuable things. Iron is worked by the specialist smith who lives in a settlement 2 miles to the west, closer to the charcoal sources in the woods. He comes here by arrangement when tools need mending. The children in the main building are falling asleep. 2 younger ones are already wrapped in their blankets on the bench nearest the fire. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 9, is still sitting with her eyes open, watching the fire. The fire has been built up a little for the night. Heavier logs have been placed on it, oak this time, which burns slowly and holds its heat. It will last until the first grey light before someone needs to feed it again. The woman who cooked the evening meal is setting the empty pot aside. She pours a little water into it from a clay jug and leaves it to soak near the hearth stones. The wooden bowls have been wiped out with a twist of dried grass and set back in their stack. Everything in this household has its place. The organization of a small space shared by many people requires that. Nothing is left where it will be tripped over in the dark. Outside, the green-blue of the sky is entirely gone now. The darkness is full. The stars are out in number, far more than would be visible in this valley in any later century. There is no other light for many miles. To the east, the low ground of Strathmore stretches away toward the coast at Montrose, some 30 miles distant. There are other settlements in that direction, other fires burning behind other palisades. None of them are visible from here. Each is an island of firelight in a wide dark. The sounds of the night settle in. An owl calls from the oak trees across the river. It calls twice and then is silent. The river continues its low conversation with the gravel. The cattle make occasional sounds in their enclosure, the soft rhythmic tearing of hay, the slow movement of large animals settling for the night. The dogs do not stir. A man on a low hill to the northeast of the settlement is keeping watch. He is wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, dark brown, pinned at the shoulder with a simple iron brooch. The cloak is woven from the fleece of the settlement's own sheep, woven on an upright loom inside the main building over the course of last winter. It is dense and tight woven. It keeps the wind out well enough. He stands without moving much, listening to the sounds of the dark. He can see the faint glow of the fire through the smoke hole of the main building below him. He can see the pale outline of the palisade posts in the starlight. He knows the shape of the valley in the dark from years of standing here. He knows which sounds belong to the night and which do not. A fox barks once from somewhere down toward the river. He does not move at that. He has heard foxes on every watch he has kept since he was old enough to keep one. The night air is cool but not yet cold. It is late August in this valley, and the warmth of the season has not yet fully gone from the ground. But there is a change coming. You can feel it in the air after sundown, a dampness, a weight that was not there in high summer. The mornings start cold now. The frost will come in a matter of weeks. There is still work before that happens. Root vegetables to bring in from the field strips below the settlement, wool to be finished on the loom, meat to be salted, firewood to be cut and stacked along the south wall of The last light drains from the sky somewhere above the mouth, that long ridge of hills running east toward the sea. The sun has gone down behind the higher ground to the west. The valleys below hold the darkness first. The hilltops keep a faint grey glow for a little while longer, then that too fades. There are no lamps along any road here. There are no roads in the way a later century would understand the word. There are tracks worn into the earth by cattle and by people moving between settlements. They become invisible now. A man who does not know them well enough to walk them in darkness stays where he is until morning. The settlements themselves are small, a cluster of round houses set within a bank and ditch, or sometimes within a timber palisade. The structures are low to the ground. Their walls are of stone where stone is plentiful, and in the straths of Angus and Strathian stone is not hard to find. The roofs are thatched with heather or with reeds cut from the wetland edges. From above, if anyone could see from above, the rooftops would be nearly invisible against the dark ground. Inside the largest of these houses, a fire still burns on a central hearth. It burns low at this hour. The fuel is peat, cut from the bogs through the summer months and dried through August. Peat holds its heat long after the flame has settled. The ember glow is enough to see hands by, nothing more. The smoke rises through a hole left in the thatch above. Some of it finds that hole. The rest moves slowly through the interior, finding its way out between the thatch stems. The air inside smells of peat smoke, of damp wool, of cattle. The cattle are not outside tonight. They have been brought in through a low doorway at one end of the roundhouse. This is common practice across the Pictish settlements of Strathian, of the Mearns, of the coastal plain between Montrose and the mouth of the Tay. The animals and the people share the same structure, divided by nothing more than a low wicker hurdle or a line of posts. The warmth of the cattle rises through the space. It is a practical arrangement. The animals are safe from wolves and from the cold. The people are warmer for it. There are wolves in these hills. Not many by this point in the year, the deep of the autumn, but they move at night along the high ground between the Grampian Massif and the lower straths. A dog tied near the outer bank of a settlement will hear them before any person does. That sound, a low sustained baying, carries clearly on a still night. The people inside the houses know what it means. They do not need to investigate. The bank and the ditch and the palisade where one exists are enough. The dogs themselves are not pets in any later sense of the word. They are working animals. They guard, they herd, they hunt. They sleep outside when the weather permits, curled against the base of the bank or against a stone wall. On a night in late October, the air carries a bite to it. The dog is awake before sleep and may not sleep deeply at all. Its ears move independently, tracking sounds no person can hear. Above the settlements, the sky is very clear. The hills of the Grampians to the north and west block no stars to the south and east, where the land opens toward the firth. The Milky Way is visible as a solid band of light. The Picts have names for the stars and for the patterns in them. Those names have not survived. The stars themselves are the same stars visible tonight over the same ground, in the same positions they occupied then, near enough. The moon tonight is past its full. It rose in the east perhaps 2 hours after sunset, clearing the low ridge beyond the settlement by the time the household fires had burned down to their lowest point. The moonlight reaches the open ground around the buildings. It touches the thatch of the rooftops. It lies along the surface of the nearest watercourse, a small burn running down from the higher ground and cutting through the valley floor to join a larger river, perhaps half a mile to the south. That river is the Erne, or the Tay, or the South Esk, depending on which of the many Pictish settlements we are standing nearest. These rivers are not the same rivers a person would see today. Their courses have shifted over centuries of flooding and silting. Their banks are unmanaged, overgrown with alder and willow to the waterline. In some places, the floodplain is open marsh, permanently wet, growing sedge and rush in dense stands that reach above a person's waist. The river itself moves in braided channels in the wide flat sections. It is deeper and faster in the narrows. Fish move in the river at night. Salmon are running in late autumn, pressing upstream toward the gravel beds where they spawn. This is known to the settlement. Traps woven from hazel withies have been set in the shallower channels, anchored with stones. A man checked them at dusk. He will check them again at first light. The catch from a good autumn run of salmon is significant. It can be salted and dried and stored through the winter months when other food becomes scarce. The smell of the river carries into the settlement when the wind is from the south. Tonight the wind has dropped entirely. The air is still. Sounds travel further on still air than on a windy night, and the settlement generates its own sounds even now, even at this late hour. The cattle shift and breathe inside the house. One of them moves its weight from one side to the other, and the sound of hooves on compacted earth comes through the wall clearly. A child inside one of the smaller houses makes a sound once and then is quiet. The people sleep on the floor, on pallets of bracken or straw covered with skins. The skins are deer, mostly, though cattle hide is used as well. Sheep fleece is laid over the top. The wool of the local sheep is coarse by later standards, but it holds warmth effectively when kept dry. Inside a house with a peat fire and cattle sharing the space, it is rarely truly cold, not even in January. The problem in winter is moisture more than temperature. The clothing worn through the day has been set aside or is still being worn during sleep. A woolen tunic reaching to the knee, woven on an upright loom, dyed with plant material where dye is available. The yellows and browns of local plants are common. A stronger red can be obtained from certain lichens found on the rocks of the higher hills. Some garments carry geometric decoration woven into the border. The Picts are known from their carved stones to have an acute visual sense. That sense does not disappear when the cloth is made. Outside the roundhouses, the settlement ground is quiet. The space between the buildings is open, hardened by years of foot traffic and animal movement. Nothing grows there. A wooden trough sits near one of the doorways, empty now. A grinding stone lies beside the entrance to the main house, a saddle quern of local sandstone, the upper stone resting on the lower. Grain was ground on it this afternoon, the last of a day's preparation of food. The meal made from it was boiled with water in a clay pot set beside the fire, or in a wooden vessel using heated stones dropped into the liquid. Barley is the principal grain crop in this part of Scotland in the early 8th century. Oats are grown as well. Wheat is grown in smaller quantities and in favoured lowland areas. The grain harvest of this year was completed 6 weeks ago, sometime in September. The sheaves were dried and the grain stripped by hand or with a wooden flail. It has been stored in a raised granary structure, a small building set on 4 stone pillars to keep the floor off the damp ground and to obstruct the rats. The rats are persistent. A cat moves freely through the settlement for exactly this reason. Beyond the cultivated ground, which extends in irregular strips down the slope toward the river, the land is rough pasture and then woodland. The woodland is oak, birch, hazel, and alder in the wetter ground. It has not been cleared so much as managed. Hazel is coppiced, cut at the base every 8 to 12 years to produce straight poles used for building and for weaving into hurdles and wall panels. The poles cut this autumn are stacked near the settlement, pale wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The oak trees nearest the settlement have been grazed underneath by pigs turned out to feed on mast through October. The pigs are back within the settlement bank now, pennied in a small enclosure of woven hurdles near the south entrance. They are not quiet animals even at rest. They shift and grunt throughout the night. The noise is familiar and goes unnoticed by the sleeping household. Far out on the higher ground, the heather moorland begins. This is the ground used for summer grazing, when cattle and sheep are moved up from the valley settlements to the higher pastures. That movement, called transhumance in a later vocabulary, brought the herders up to temporary shelters through the summer months. Those shelters are empty now. They are small structures of stone and turf, roofed with turf barely tall enough to stand in. They will be used again next June. The high ground is completely dark from the valley. The individual shapes of hills are only visible where they cut against the sky. To the north and northwest, the Grampian Massif sits as a mass of deeper darkness against the stars. On the highest ridges, there may be frost tonight. The ground at the valley floor is cold, but not yet frozen. The first hard frost will come in November, perhaps earlier in a poor year. Nothing moves on the high ground that a human eye could see, but the sound of a stag carries down from somewhere on the hill. It is late in the rut. The sound is lower and less frequent than it was 3 weeks ago. It comes once, then does not come again. The dogs at the settlement perimeter raise their heads for a moment, then settle back against the earth. Water is the one constant sound of the night. The burn running down from the hill feeds into the valley floor with a continuous low sound that does not change with the hour or the season. It is slightly louder now than it was in August because the autumn rains have raised its level. This burn is the reason the settlement is here, positioned where it is on a slight rise above the valley floor. Fresh water, good drainage, south-facing slope for the fields, timber within a manageable distance. These requirements have placed settlements in these same positions for thousands of years before this night, and will continue to do so for centuries after. On the carved stones that the Picts leave across this landscape, figures move in procession. Horsemen ride from right to left. Animals face each other in heraldic arrangements. The double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and V-rod, the mirror and comb, appear in combinations that no later scholar has fully decoded. These carvings are already being made in this period, in the early 8th century. A stone being worked at this time might show the Pictish beast, that enigmatic creature with its curved snout and spiraling body, cut into fine-grained local sandstone with an iron tool. The craftsman who cuts such a stone is not working tonight. The tools are put away. The stone in progress, perhaps half-finished, leans against the outer wall of one of the smaller structures in the settlement. In the moonlight, its surface is flat and grey, and the incised lines catch the light at a shallow angle, just enough to suggest the form emerging from the stone. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, the work continues. But the air is very still now, and the last ember in the hearth has settled lower. And in the roundhouse, the breathing of the people and the cattle has found a common rhythm, slow and even, and the night over the Pictish heartland holds everything in its dark and